I'm riding on my brand new KTM 1290 Super Adventure R, just trying to put the first 1,000 kilometers on the bike. This is number 4 for me out of the 1290 Super Adventure lineup. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the previous 3 models that I've had in a combined 130,000 kilometers. Stay tuned. What's up, my biker friends, and welcome back to another video. This is my 4th 1290 Super Adventure from KTM. I had 3 previous models and I put lots of kilometers on it, and I've done like separate reviews on each bike pretty much, but this is sort of the combined experience that I've had with the bikes. And obviously I like the bikes, otherwise I wouldn't have bought the 4th one, but I will also draw sort of comparisons to the BMW GS that I owned previously, and I still like to ride every once in a while. So let's get started. Maybe a little history, a little backup history how I got started with KTM. My first adventure bike was not a KTM, it was actually a BMW GS, a 1200 GS triple black. Still like the design very much, still very cool design. But when I bought it at the time, I didn't so much, but it grew on me. I had that bike for 2 years, 35,000 kilometers, and then KTM came out in that time in 2017 with the predecessor of this model. It was between 2017 and 2020 when that model was available. I really liked the design. I took it out for a test ride sometime in the summer, and then I decided to sell my BMW for the KTM. And the reasons were, I wasn't unhappy with the BMW, quite on the contrary. It was an amazing bike, and I did sort of my first sort of long distance touring with the BMW. It was really, really cool. But you know, I was getting to a point where I wanted to try something different, and also I wanted something that it had a bit more character. It was a bit sportier, and just something different. And the KTM was the perfect fit. It was a lot more powerful at the time. I think the GS had something in the range of 134 horsepower. I'm not quite sure how much that was. KTM had 160, and you know, it had a lot more punch to it, of course. But also the entire characteristic of the bike. You know, this it's still to this day is the sportier bike. It's a much firmer setting, and the engine has got a little more grunt to it, it's a bit more aggressive, and the styling matched that really. So that's something I was looking for, and I wanted to try that out, and I like that a lot, obviously. Otherwise I would have bought the other ones as well. I had this first KTM for 48,000 kilometers. I did lots of kilometers on it. It was still very much me riding on the road. So I always had the sort of idea that I wanted to try the sort of whole off-road part with an adventure bike. Obviously, I was affected by the marketing, a lot of the marketing with these adventure bikes. It doesn't matter which manufacturer you're looking at. You know, always market the off-road capabilities of these large adventure touring bikes. And something I wanted to try, but I never really dared. Not until I had my first road crash with my 2018 Super Adventure S. Obviously an unplanned road crash, obviously. But I had the first scratches in the paint and the crash bars. And so I didn't feel so bad of taking the bike off-road. I always wanted to do these off-road trainings with my own motorcycle. You know, most of these places that offer this, they will give you a rental bike if you want to, but I always wanted to do it with my own bike. I wanted to learn how to ride off-road with my own bike. So after a lot of road riding, I got into off-road riding towards the end of 2019, the 2019 season. I took a very last training session, the advanced training at the Euro Action Team that they offered in the very late fall, October it was. So I did the advanced training rather than the beginner's training, not because the beginner's training is bad or anything. It's just they do a lot more talking in the beginner's training, and the practice part is a bit shorter, and I sort of learn the best when I get to do stuff, and I need some basic instructions, and then I just need to try it out for myself. So that really worked well for me, and I had a blast. I had such a great time riding a beast like this off-road, and it's amazing how much progress you make in just 2 days, coming in there and feeling really, really uneasy about taking the bike on loose ground. And then after those 2 days, it really builds confidence. It's quite amazing, I have to say. So that worked really well. And then the next year, I had ideas to do something with that. But then that was 2020. We all know what happened 2020. Corona hit. And it just kind of messed with all my plans that I had for the day. All the travel plans were scrapped, basically, like for most people. It was... that didn't happen, all these trips. But because we were only allowed to travel very close to where we lived, and sometimes even just within the country, the Enduro Action Team is actually very close to where I live. It's one of the few things that is close to my home. Most of the things that I do on a motorcycle are actually pretty far away. So I ended up spending a lot of time at the Enduro Action Team. There are tons of videos on this channel from all my events that I joined and the trainings, and all my travel budget in that year went to off-road training. And luckily, we ended up going on a trip, because when I had this idea of riding a bike off-road, there were two sort of bucket list destinations for me for the off-road journey on an adventure bike. And one was Iceland, which I didn't get to do until last year in 24. And the other was the West Alps, the old military roads. I saw videos of that. It looked absolutely spectacular, something I always wanted to do. So we ended up doing that West Alps in 2020 with Thomas, who had been my travel buddy for a long time, like up until that point. And then that's where I met Jochen, who ended up being a travel buddy after that. We did a lot of trips together. And this is the first time that I took the motorcycle on an off-road trip and outside the enduro park, which is really, really awesome. We had a great time. We are traveling without luggage, which was great. And if you're interested, there's a long video on that journey and all the things that went wrong, a lot of things that broke, a lot of things, but we had a blast. It was such a memorable event. I found that the S model that I had, the street bias model, that the suspension system wasn't really coping with that kind of environment. It is marketed towards, off-road ride. You can certainly ride off-road, but even for me, as someone that was relatively new to off-road riding and not an expert in suspension or any of that, I could definitely tell there was a difference how the bike behaved and that the suspension was hitting its limits. And I knew that KTM was making this version, the R version, which is more geared towards off-road riding. And the bikes are very, very similar. There's really just two things that are different, and that's the suspension system and it's the wheels and the wheel sizes. So the R version has larger wheels. It's got 21-inch front wheel. It's got the 18 in the rear. And the street bias version has a 19 in the front and 17 in the rear. And that sort of 19-17 combination is a very common combination that you find on the GSs and most other bikes. It's sort of that sweet spot between sort of a smaller road biased tire dimension or wheel dimension to the off-road end, which is the 21-inch front wheel. But it's the suspension that really made the major difference. The next bike, because of that, was the R version. And if you can't decide, by the way, between the S and the R version, I had a hard time understanding what the real differences is, because they are so similar. And I know Triumph makes very similar things too. They have different trims of their bikes as well. BMW for some reason doesn't, but some manufacturers do have different versions with different wheel sizes and different suspension system. I did a dedicated video on that. I put up a link here or a link in the description if you want to see it, the R versus the S, and what the actual differences are, and where you can tell the difference and where you can't tell the difference, which is most of the time where you can't tell the difference. I started doing more off-road riding with the bike, but also noticed, because the suspension is quite a bit higher up and the center of gravity on these bikes, as opposed to a BMW, is quite high with that V engine. Most motorcycles in that category have the weight kind of high up. The BMW GSs are the only exception, you know, with the inline twin cylinder, the boxer engine, that has a very, very low center of gravity, and most bikes don't have that. They don't balance as well as the BMW. And there's some that are really bad, and the 1290 was pretty bad in that regard, of balancing, you know, having the weight high up. That wasn't so much of an issue with the S model, but with the R model, because it was even higher off the ground, and the off-road riding was doing, a lot of the times I didn't notice, because I always, every time I dropped the bike, I had always someone to help me pick it up. Especially in enduro park, you know, you hardly ever have to pick up your bike by yourself. You know, you always kind of get tired, and you have to conserve your energy if you go through trainings like this, and it's not a big deal. You know, if you see someone else drop their bike, you help them too. But I had to pick up the bike a few times by myself, and you know, throughout the middle of a training, I had such a hard time picking up the bike, to a point where I couldn't even pick it up. It was like laying flat in the sand at some point, and I just couldn't pick it up. Couldn't pick up the damn bike by myself. You know, I was tired, you know, probably didn't have the best technique to pick it up, and it was in the sand. Either way, I was like, oh, this ever happens to you if you ride solo, which isn't often, but if it happens and you get stranded and you can't pick up the bike, that's really bad. Right around the time when KTM had the successor coming out, this model, the 2021 plus model, everything that came afterwards is still the current model. Still to this day, the 1390 isn't out yet, so that's the current model of the Super Adventure. And this is the 24, and the one that I previously had was the 22 model. So when they came out and I did a first test ride, I actually did the first test ride off-road in the Enduro Action Team. They were at the time just partnering 1 year with KTM. Unfortunately, that partnership discontinued after the first year. Not sure why. Would have been a really good partnership, I think. But anyway, they had a very, very early version of sort of this model of the 1290, and of course I was very curious to ride it. I had to just try it out, and I was quite astonished how much better it would handle. You know, of course I read up on the bike, and the major changes that they've made. They said they made a lot of changes to the bike, but the major changes that you could feel was the tank design, the split tank design, trying to get the fuel lower to the ground, something they had started doing with the 790s and 890 series, and they started doing that with the larger bikes. And even though you don't get GS-like riding feeling, and none of the bikes will ever do that, but it got really close. Really close. It got better. Let's put it this way: it got better, and the lower fuel, the center of gravity, was noticeably better than of the predecessor. And the other good side effect of the split tank design is that the bike got a bit wider around the bottom. Doesn't necessarily look better. I think the old one looks sleeker and nicer. You know, if it's a slim bike, this one bulges out a little bit. Not as bad as the 790 and 890 series, but it helps if you have crash bars. It helps that the bike doesn't lay as flat anymore on the ground, and it makes it, that in combination with the lower center of gravity, made it so much easier to pick up the bike, especially picking it up by myself. And that was one of the key drivers for me to switch earlier than I normally do to the next motorcycle. Typically I try to switch the bike when I have reached about 40, maybe 50,000 kilometers, and not because I don't trust the bikes to last any longer. It's just a point where if I'm reselling it, there's still value in it for someone to ride the bike. You know, most people don't ride that much, and if you buy it 40,000 kilometer on a bike, you know, a used bike with 40,000 kilometers, there's still quite a bit of riding you can do, especially with these larger motors. They last you a long time. You know, it's harder to sell a bike that has 80,000 or 90,000 on it. You know, at that point you might as well just keep driving it or riding it until it dies. So that's the reason why I sort of switched bikes at that mark. So I switched it a bit early. I think it was 35,000 kilometers in that case, and I switched to this current model. And the main reason was because of the sort of changed design. Be easier to pick up, the handling got a little better. The other thing that I didn't know until I had the bike is that they also made changes to the suspension system. Very, very subtle. They didn't really advertise that much at all. They should have. But you see, the suspension is really hard to grasp in most cases. You know, with horsepower and torque, it's easy. You put a number at it and everyone knows the bigger number makes it better. Suspension, it doesn't have anything. It's hard to put that in numbers and sort of explain how a suspension system is different and how it's better. You have to actually feel it and ride it and experience it. So that's, I guess, the reason why no one really talks about it. But they've made quite a difference, because the predecessor, my first R version, even though it had much better suspension than the S version, it wasn't really balanced that way, in the sense that my front fork, and I'm not such a hardcore rider at all, but the front fork, I would see that bottoming out quite a bit. And in order to prevent that from happening, I had to set the suspension set into its sports setting, stiffest setting basically. It's a comfort setting, a standard, and a sports setting. The sports setting is the stiffest setting overall, and it was fine. Stiff setting is also good for riding on road, having a sportier setting, so I was fine with it. Until I rode this model, where I could leave everything in standard mode, and the fork would not bottom out, which was great, because now you had the comfort, especially off-road. It was a bit more plush, and still very good progression in the suspension system, and overall it was a much better ride. So that was another big plus of having sort of this version. There's a few things that it didn't do so well on this bike, and I talked about it in sort of respective review. Check them out if you're interested in that. And just to kind of close out the point, the sort of kilometers that I put on the bike, my 2022 model hit the 40,000. That's why I'm on my fourth 1290 Super Adventure R KTM. I've got lots of trips planned this year, and it kind of made sense to, switch to a new motorcycle. That's why I switched it. Let's talk about quality and service. Now, I put about 130,000 kilometers on the first three 1290 Super Adventure KTMs, and with the exception of one problem, that was the big problem, but with the exception of one problem, I'll get to that in a second, I had no issues at all. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about the quality and the service quality of KTM. Most of it is for the 790 and 890 series. These 1290s, they are usually not that much in focus of things going wrong. And there's two things with the quality and the service, and I think I mentioned that in other videos. I don't think the quality, with the exceptions of the camshaft of the 790s before someone says something, is such a big deal with KTM. I think they make pretty good quality products. No one complains about how well these motorcycles ride, how well this is put together. You hardly ever see that. And the technical issues, the smaller ones that they have, other manufacturers like BMW has a lot of issues. They had a lot of issues with the 1250 GS going on with the drive shaft, having major issues and recalls and things like that, and also the 1300. They had lots of issues with that. The difference is that BMW is pretty quick to respond with their service and take care of the issues, and that's, I think, one of the things that really annoyed people with KTMs, especially the ones that had camshaft issues. That it took KTM a long time to even acknowledge that there was a problem, let alone helping the customers out with their issues. So that's a lot where the frustration comes from. And I can't say much about the smaller, it's one single cylinder off-road bikes. I've never had one of these. I'm just talking about the adventure bikes, the mid-size and the larger adventure bikes. I was lucky, I didn't have any issues with all the bikes. The S model was perfect, not a single problem with the bike. The second R version was a perfect bike for me. It wasn't until my 2022 model that I had my first issue, and if you follow the channel for a little bit, you know what that is. I had a catastrophic engine failure on my 2022 model in the fall of, it was September of 2023. The engine completely disintegrated at a speed of 190 kilometers on the Autobahn. If you're interested in the full story, I'll link the videos. I've got a couple of videos on that where I sort of talk about the issue and what happened and what I could say there and how the story was. Just in short though, I still to this day don't know what the cause of it was. I think no one knows, because the engine was basically sent back as it was to KTM for a replacement, a brand new engine, a replacement that KTM then installed. And at the end of the day, it was still in warranty. KTM took care of the issue. I had a bike which was running really well. I did lots of cool stuff with it, and I was quite happy. No issues after that. The only gripe I would have with it, it took a bit longer than I wanted to, because it takes a long time, this whole back and forth with the service. But I was lucky that I had, people that I knew that were nice enough to give me a motorcycle, a replacement motorcycle for the time I didn't have one, especially for the 2 trips that I had planned. It was on the way to Munich. So I was lucky to have that. It wasn't necessarily KTM that helped, but it would have been nice if KTM would give me a bike, but they didn't. But Stefan did, which was nice. So in the end, things were taken care of, and considering some of the experience that other people had, just from what you guys put in the comment section, I know I was overall relatively lucky with it. But that was it. That was all the issues on 130,000 kilometers. And I would say the engine issue is definitely a one-off, a really relatively rare thing that would happen, from at least from what I understand. So quite happy with the quality. Let's see how this one is. Well, at the end of the season, if it stays that way. And I can't say what the next bike is going to be. I'm not sure if it's going to be the 1390 or some other bike, but I'm very happy to have this one for the moment. Let me talk really quick about the comparison between the BMW GS series, the 1250 or 1300 GS, versus the current version of the 1290 and the Super Adventure. And what the sort of major, a lot of people ask, what's the difference between the two bikes? And just for the record, I still like the GS series from BMW. I'm actually quite happy when I get to ride one every once in a while. The last time I had a longer trip with the GS was the 1300 GS, and I had 1,000 kilometers with it. Stefan called me up because he needed someone to help him break in the bikes. Same thing I'm doing with this bike at the moment, just trying to fill up the first 1,000 kilometers for the first service. And he had a few customers waiting for a long-term rental, and he needed to put the first 1,000 kilometers on to get the first oil change done and stuff. So he called me up and asked me if I'm up for it. So we had 2 days to put 1,000 kilometers on the brand new 1300 GSs. And I had a blast. It was such a great motorcycle, and it was a bit controversial, at least among the BMW community when it came out, for its design and what it looked like and so on. It wasn't as bulky anymore as the old one. But I liked the bike, and even before that, when I got to ride, most of my friends have GSs that I ride with, so sometimes I get to ride with bikes. So awesome bikes. I think the biggest downside of this bike being so good is it's almost too good to a point where it's almost a bit without character and boring. I don't know, I don't know a better way to put it really, but it's so well done, it's so perfect that it lacks that character. And I think that's kind of what still drives me to KTM. The engine has a bit more character, it has more grunt. It's also a tiny bit sportier, so it's something that would be easy for BMW to change the suspension system. You can crank it up to its sportiest setting, and it's about as sporty as the standard setting on a KTM. Now I like being able to set it a bit sportier for off-road and for on-road use. Now I can certainly be happy with what BMW has on the GS models, but I wish that you could sort of trim it a bit to the sportier side. But it has never been. It was always all the past models as well. They were also more on the comfort side as compared to probably Ducati and on KTM. So I think that's one of the things. There's a lot of things they do equally well, but it's that, having that extra character on the bike, the engine characteristic, the extra punch. Even though I have to say the 1300 now, it has a lot of punch where it counts. It may not get to the same top speed as this bike, but where it counts, on an alpine pass, coming out of a hairpin corner and fully opening the throttle, it's got so much torque. It was hard for me to keep up when Stefan was riding in front of me. It's a cold diesel, I know we were going up quite fast, and it was coming out of those corners. You can tell I wasn't getting very close to him or accelerating any faster than he was out of his corner. So when it comes to usable power with the GS, you're completely fine. It's just on the top speed and probably where you get a bit faster with this one here, but most people don't do that and don't want to do it, and it's not important to them. So that was one reason, and the second reason is that when it comes to off-road riding, which I don't do that much, most of my kilometers are still on pavement. I still ride on pavement. I still like riding on pavement. I like doing tours on pavement, and I love riding off-road. But when you look at the kilometers that I spend off-road, I spend a lot on pavement and not on off-road. But having that better suspension, an option that isn't available on the BMWs, you get something with more suspension travel, but you don't get the same quality of suspension. You know, it's not bad, but it's not as precise as this one. Better suspension. Best stock suspension on the large adventure touring bike is definitely KTM suspension on the R model of this. Hands down. There isn't anything better. You can go aftermarket and upgrade the suspension for a lot of money, but I think stock, this is it. This is where the buck stops at the moment. Also, having the larger wheels is great. There's a few occasions where these larger wheels make a difference. I'm sure there will be lots of BMW riders that will be happy to have a GS, a large GS, they're smaller GS, but you know, the Boxer engine GSs, with a option of having larger wheels. I know some people do custom changes to it because they like the larger wheels. Not sure why they didn't do it with this iteration. It would have been easy to do. So that's another benefit of this bike when you do ride off-road, having sort of better suspension and the larger wheels on a massive adventure bike. I also think it looks cooler. These larger wheels just look better. These are massive motorcycles, and small wheels just look funny to me. That's just a visual thing. So maybe even if I wasn't riding it off-road, I still think they look better. The R version with the larger wheels, but you know, that's not really a good enough reason. But I still think they look better. Anyway, that's it. So guys, there you have it. A little bit of a recap and history and comparison to the BMW motorcycles of this bike. I'm super stoked to have this brand new 1290 Super Adventure R again. It's so much fun. It's kind of nice to be on a new bike too. It rides a little newer, of course, but I wasn't unhappy with the old bike because it was a fantastic bike. And like I said, I have a lot of tours planned for this bike, so I hope it's going to be a trusty companion without any issues. And I hope that KTM gets through their issues, their financial issues. As you know, they're still struggling with the financials and getting everything back on board. Hope to see more products from them. Anyway, if you got questions or comments, this is not a comment review. The questions, comments, something you want to see, there's definitely lots of reviews I have done already. I'll link some of those in the description if you're interested. But if you got questions, just shoot them in the comment section. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, ride safe and stay awesome.